We are recording this session so that it will be available afterwards. And before I tell you a little bit more about what's going to happen, I just want to run through a few housekeeping notes. So everyone's cameras and microphones will be switched off during the lecture, but the chat function will be open and we'll be able to use that for questions at the end. I will be taking questions from the chat and putting them to Frank before we need to finish. If you do have problems with bandwidth or connecting, then the first thing we suggest is to try Google Chrome rather than another browser. But unfortunately, sometimes the connection wavers and you get kicked out. But please feel free to log back in and join us. If you have real problems, again, we will be recording, and you can see that available from the end of this week. So if you are interested in attending more of these events, then please do keep in touch and we can let you know about things that are happening. Equally, if you have questions about the lecture or you want to ask Frank some more questions afterwards, then please do get in contact with us and we will pass them on. So without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome you to the final lecture of our professorial inaugural lecture series this academic year. And we have Professor Frank Tanser, who is going to talk to us about his research and his achievements. And these are very much a celebration of where our professors have come from. So Frank is a global professor. He's been brought in particularly to the university to help make connections around the world to increase Lincoln's visibility and research standing. I'm just here to facilitate again, so I'm going to hand over to Professor Duncan French, the Pro-Vice Chancellor for the College of Social Science, who's going to give a much more formal introduction to Frank and his presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Stuart. Hopefully everybody can hear me, and it's lovely to be able to introduce Frank and his inaugural lecture this evening, especially after the difficult year and a half that we've had. So it's delightful that we're able to, even if only meet virtually, to celebrate Frank's achievements. So as Stuart said, Frank is the Global Professor in Rural Health, as well as the founding director of the Lincoln International Institute for Rural Health. He was the founding member of the Wellcome Trust Africa Centre for Health and Population Studies in South Africa back in 1997. Now, Frank is an infectious disease epidemiologist, and his research is focused on the epidemiology of some important public health problems in rural communities, particularly in Southern Africa. His pivotal work over the last 22 years in a South African rural community, which was decimated by HIV, has provided substantial insights into the evolving and dynamic nature of the HIV epidemic and its key drivers, informing HIV prevention and treatment efforts in sub-Saharan Africa. His research into population impacts of the antiretroviral therapy has led to wide-reaching and rapid changes to government policy on how such programs in Africa are designed and implemented. Now, Frank has had a significant track record in terms of both research awards and also being recognised for the excellence of his science. So Frank was recently honoured by the South African Medical Research Council with the Gold Medal Scientific Achievement Award in recognition of the excellence of his work. The award recognises, and I quote, outstanding scientists who have undertaken seminal research that has impacted on the health of populations in developing countries. And in 2019, the Royal Geographical Society awarded Frank the Bach Medal for, again, quote, conducting applied research that has made an outstanding contribution to the development of national or international public policy. Frank and his wife Leonie and their 3 children moved to Lincoln in 2019 and have settled in nearby Netlham. Frank is a keen runner, tennis player, cricketer and golfer. His love of the outdoors, however, has occasionally landed him in tricky situations, And he told me once it nearly landed him in a near-death experience with a black rhino. So I don't know if he's going to tell us about that tonight or not, but I'm going to hand over to Frank. So everyone, Professor Frank Tanser.
Fantastic, thanks, Duncan. I'll just call up my slides here. But thanks again, Duncan, for that kind introduction, and good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure and a privilege and an honor to be able to give this lecture. And I'm going to be speaking about some work that I was involved in over the last 21 years in South Africa, but also speak about my journey along the way. So the title of my presentation is The Rise and Fall of South Africa's HIV Epidemic, a Personal Perspective. So I've structured my talk like this. I want to speak about my background, some of the early research during the early years into HIV, and then speak about the who, what, where of HIV epidemiology in the setting where I was working. So firstly, my background, I want to pay tribute up front to my wife and 3 children who moved with me from South Africa, as Duncan mentioned, to Lincoln in late 2019. So we've been here almost 2 years in September. I'm the founding director of the Lincoln International Institute for Rural Health, which has its vision is to be known as the preeminent rural health institution worldwide. And we seek to conduct world-class research that addresses the greatest health issues facing rural communities, both locally and globally. So please do come and see us in the new medical school. We'd love to speak to you about any work to do with rural health or anything in general. But my presentation this afternoon is about my journey to this point. So that's what I want to focus on now. And it's quite amazing that I'm back living not too far away from where my grandfather was born in Leicestershire in 1900. So he actually died 42 years ago today. So I think it's good that I should mention him. He then moved to what was then Southern Rhodesia as a young man, took up teaching, became a headmaster, became inspector of schools, and eventually became mayor of Salisbury, which was then Salisbury, which is now Harare. So it's really interesting that I've kind of come back to some roots not too far away. And I'm finding that there are connections everywhere. The Bomber Command Memorial, where the University of Lincoln has played a significant role in setting up, many of you have been to, and the 31-meter spire is exactly the wingspan of a Lancashire bomber and features the names of 57,000 people who lost their lives in Bomber Command during World War II. But I was very intrigued to find, when I was going through the names at that memorial, to find a long-lost cousin, Sydney Thomas Tanser, born in Leicestershire in 1925, killed at the age of 19, and you can go into the database and see pictures of his grave. So I'm finding that there's connections everywhere, and I feel a sense of belonging that goes well beyond the nearly 2 years that I've been here. So that was a little side note, but now onto my background. So as I mentioned, I was born and raised in Zimbabwe. Duncan mentioned I'm an infectious disease epidemiologist with a keen interest in the space-time evolution of infectious diseases, both to better understand epidemic spread, but also with a view to designing more effective interventions. And I started off life doing my BSc honours at Rhodes University in South Africa in geography and geology, and then did a master's in hydrology. And that's where I was introduced to GIS and remote sensing, which I'll speak about later, but that's something that I've then applied throughout my career in epidemiology. I then went on to do a PhD at the University of Natal in health sciences. But I always felt that I needed a formal education in epidemiology. So as part of a Wellcome Trust Fellowship, I went and studied epidemiology at Imperial College in London. and was lectured by many of the people that are appearing on the TV around COVID, like Neil Ferguson. And actually Zaid Askar, who is associate professor at the university, was one of my lecturers as well. So I'll speak a little bit more about that slightly bizarre career trajectory, but it always interests me that when one hears about someone's career choices, it's always presented as a set of kind of logical steps, when in fact serendipity and chance meetings of sort of inspiring individuals can completely change a career. And that's how it was with me. So my journey, in talking through my journey, I want to particularly honor 4 men who played a really pivotal role in mentoring me during the early phases of my career. And that's Tony Palmer, who's based at Rhodes University, David Lasser and Brian Sharp from the Medical Research Council, and David Wilkinson also from the Medical Research Council. And it's been a great privilege to work with these remarkable men who inspired me in the early stage of my career. And I think actually Tony Palmer might be on the call, so hi Tony. So Tony first introduced me to satellite imagery and GIS, and together we published a couple of papers arising from my MSc. But the fact that one could use satellite imagery captured kind of thousands of kilometers above the Earth's surface and make some sort of inference about land management strategies on a small patch of ground as big as my garden was incredible to me at that stage. So I was instantly attracted to this field. Next, I'd like to mention David Lasser and Brian Sharp, who were responsible for easing me into health research, and sadly both have passed away. I had just completed my master's at Rhodes with Tony, and my wife and I were all set to go back to Zimbabwe, and in fact had packed a container full of our belongings and sent it to Zimbabwe when, kind of at the 11th hour, got an opportunity for an interview, a last-minute interview at the MRC, flew to Durban, met David Lasser, and was so inspired by the man, decided to take up a post there. So I was initially offered a 6-month contract, and I said to my wife, well, we'll take 6 months, and then we'll go back to Zimbabwe. And of course 6 months turned into 24 years, and I stayed in that field, and really enjoyed it and found my niche, as it were. Brian Sharp as well was a sort of old school entomologist, very skilled leader, also really inspired me a lot of the work that I did with them. So these were some of the papers published in the Lancet on the potential effect of climate change on malaria transmission in Africa. And David Lasser conceived something called the Mapping Malaria Risk in Africa project, which took 10,000 parasite surveys from across Africa and geolocated them for the first time, kind of bringing them all together. And we used that data to build models of malaria transmission and then step it forward through various climate change scenarios. So the map on the top left there shows the current distribution of malaria according to the model, and then the subsequent maps show what malaria might look like under various climate change scenarios. And what we found is surprisingly little latitudinal effect of climate change on malaria, but lots of altitudinal change, so moving into sort of high altitude areas. And this publication had quite a large impact. David Wilkinson was also a very inspiring individual. He was the superintendent of the Hlabisa Hospital, which I'll mention just now, where we set up the HIV surveillance work. And as well as being superintendent of the hospital, he was also a prolific scientist. And he used to keep a graph next to his desk of publications that per year. And he generally used to hit about 50, so it was about 1 a week. But he used to do pretty much all of the analysis and the writing. So he was just a highly productive individual, and kind of taught me what science was all about, taught me a lot about epidemiology and making inference from observational data. So I want to particularly honor those 4 men. and this is some of the work that David Wilkinson and I published together, also in the Lancet, around sort of access through the tuberculosis directly observed treatment strategy, which was kind of community-based, and the change going from hospital to community-based, and what that meant for access. But even as I mentioned, even though I was kind of publishing in the health arena, I still felt I didn't have a proper training. So when I got the opportunity to go to Imperial College as part of the Wellcome Trust Fellowship, I grabbed it with both arms, and I really loved the training and the whole program there. So that's a little bit of a whirlwind tour on my background, and I want to now speak about the early years of HIV research. But before I do that, just perhaps take some time to just orientate the audience to HIV. So this is a map of HIV prevalence across the world. So 38 million people affected, living with HIV in 2020, and 1.7 million acquired HIV during 2020. But 70% of people living with HIV live in sub-Saharan Africa. And within sub-Saharan Africa, you can see Southern Africa is the sort of the area of highest prevalence. Within Southern Africa, South Africa is the country with the highest prevalence. And within South Africa, KwaZulu-Natal, the province, is the province with the highest prevalence of HIV. And that's where the work that I'll speak about just now was largely conducted. Just to put that in context, there were 1.8 million deaths due to HIV in 2004. That was at its peak. And from COVID-19 in 2020, there were 1.8 million deaths. So it's just staggering the number of people that have actually been infected and died from HIV. And the difference between HIV and COVID is that one of the differences is that HIV was responsible for those sort of numbers year on year on year on year. But now, thankfully, that's decreased quite a lot to around about 700,000. And also, other major difference with COVID-19 is that Africa accounts only for in 2020, for about 3.6% of all deaths. And of course, there's a slight underreporting there, but in general, just completely different diseases affecting completely different populations. People often forget that South Africa was well on its way through the health transition when HIV hit. So if you look at this series of graphs, the graph on the top left there shows the blue is the proportion due to non-communicable diseases, and then the green are injuries, and the red is HIV/AIDS. So if you look at 1997, when HIV was just starting to emerge, the greatest cause of death was non-communicable diseases. And then you can see, stepping forward in 2000 to 2005, with HIV really at its peak, it just completely dominated the picture, particularly in the sort of younger, more productive age groups, so about the 20 to 30-year-olds. This graph just shows how HIV just ripped through the country. So in 1990, when the prevalence there was less than 0.7%, already by around 2004-05, it was already 30%. This is amongst antenatal women. So just absolutely ripped through the country and kind of decimated large portions of the population. I mentioned that in South Africa there's incredible heterogeneity, and that's something that I'll return to throughout the talk. But in KwaZulu-Natal, there you see the prevalence at nearly 40%, compared to somewhere like the Western Cape, where it was about 16%. So very heterogeneous, even within South Africa. So the work that I'm going to be largely speaking about took place in the northeast of the country, quite close to the border with Swaziland, now Eswatini. And I'll talk about this just now, but in that grey area that you see on the right, we set up something called an HIV surveillance. So in that area, which is about 20 kilometers by 20 kilometers, what's that, sort of 13 miles by 13 miles, there are 90,000 people living. and every one of those people were entered into a database and were visited and tested for HIV every year. So every adult in that population was tested for HIV every year since 2003. And the value of that data over time is that it's population based. So it's not biased by people who choose to go to clinic. It gives a very clear indication of what's going on with the epidemic. So this is one of the largest HIV cohorts in the world. But I'll speak a little bit more about it as we go along. It's a Zulu-speaking population, a very impoverished population. It's largely rural, but there are pockets of urban and peri-urban populations, which I'll speak about just now. So I couldn't resist showing this picture. This motley crew of intrepid individuals was taken at the very first meeting of what was to become the Africa Centre. And there I am in the bottom left. My colleagues say I look about 6 years old at this time. But I think what was interesting is when we were setting this thing up, none of us really had a clue what we were doing. I think we had to learn a lot as we went. But there were a lot of kind of preconceptions about how the epidemic would evolve. And there was a lot of skepticism about the use of space or spatial technologies in kind of analyzing the epidemic. Because these GIS and spatial technologies had been largely applied to environmental diseases like malaria, so there wasn't a kind of history of using it for sexually transmitted disease. But also there was an expectation that the epidemic would take off, it would just explode, it would go everywhere, and it would become ubiquitous. So kind of spatial heterogeneity would disappear. And so kind of any talk about targeting specific communities was considered anathema, because the feeling was that it was just going to explode and go absolutely everywhere. And of course, what we've seen from COVID and other epidemics is that infectious disease epidemics are hardly ever homogeneous. There's always pockets of high transmission, low transmission. And what I'll show just now is that not only did we find that heterogeneity didn't decrease or it didn't become homogeneous, but we actually found that the heterogeneity increased over time. And that, I believe, provides a real opportunity for kind of targeted interventions. This amazing group of young women were the first field workers that we employed. And they walked, they mapped over 26,000 homesteads, over 1,400 square kilometers. And many of them have kind of stayed at the center, and it's been great to watch them rise through the ranks. One of them became a high-ranking public health official in the Department of Health. One actually became a traffic cop and pulled me over for speeding somewhere near Mpangeni in South Africa. And it was I would just say it was a particularly joyous reunion from my side. But tragically, 4 of them in this photo succumbed to the very virus that they were helping us to study. So really underlying the type of environment that we were working in. I mentioned that they mapped 26,000 homesteads across 1,400 square kilometers, and at this stage, sort of late 90s, early 2000s, sort of GPS technology was very new, and the US military had introduced an intentional random error into the position. So you couldn't use a GPS like you do now to navigate and all those sorts of things, because there was a deliberate error in the positions, and the positions used to jump around the whole time. So the only way that you could correct those positions was to have a GPS at a known location, which you had mapped very accurately, and then compare how much it varied from second to second, and then kind of differentially correct the positions from the roving GPS units. So all of that we had to do for these 26,000 homesteads. So every night field workers would bring back the GPSs. We'd then have to kind of differentially correct all of the positions at night. But this acted as a very powerful platform on which we could build a lot of the research that we were eventually able to do. This was the original office. We had at a garage. We had 4 of us behind the fuel pumps there. So it started from very humble beginnings. So this graph shows the first results of the first HIV prevalence survey. So in that grey area that I showed you earlier, 90,000 people, all of the adults were tested for HIV in 2003. And these were some of the highest population, or the highest population-based prevalence of HIV ever documented worldwide. You can see amongst women in the age group 25 to 29, peaked at over 50%. And what you can also see is this incredible differential between males and females in the early ages. So at the age of 15 to 19, it's about 10% in females, less than 1% in males. And then there's quite a substantial differential until the age of about 30 to 34. So that was incredibly sobering. And it was actually a very difficult time to be in HIV. There was a kind of dark chapter in South Africa's history. And the president, Thabo Mbeki, at the time, used to kind of surf the web at night. And he found some conspiracy theorists who suggested that HIV didn't cause AIDS. And so as a result, kind of refused to roll out antiretroviral therapy. And that kind of dithering, it took a long time, and eventually civil action groups took the government to court and forced them to roll out antiretroviral therapy. But that delay was estimated conservatively to have resulted in 300,000 deaths, or more than 2.2 million years of life lost. So to put that in context, so far in the UK, there's been 128,000 deaths from COVID-19. So this was 300,000 completely avoidable deaths. Again, this isn't only people who died of HIV. This is people who only if they'd had the treatment available would have lived. So it was a very difficult time to be in HIV because relations with the government were incredibly tense. And this is how one of the cartoonists, Jonathan Shapiro, saw the whole thing, because the president basically convened a quack panel to tell him whether HIV caused AIDS. And so, South Africa sort of became, to some extent, the laughingstock of the world. So it was a terrible time to be in HIV for a number of reasons, not least of which there was nothing you could really do for people. And these were sort of some of the scenes at the time. This is another cartoon by Jonathan Shapiro. So we had a kind of disastrous health minister at the time who was advocating the treatment of HIV with beetroot, lemon, and garlic. And so a false lemon is not a vegetable. So it was just, but thankfully what I'll show just now is the whole situation turned around, and thankfully we were able to move past that era. So I now want to speak about the who, what, and where of HIV, and firstly on the who. So who are the most at risk in terms of HIV? Well, the one group that consistently have shown up as being at very high risk of HIV are migrants. So the high rates of internal migration, which were rooted in the apartheid era policies, were aimed at ensuring the supply of rural African male laborers to the mines, particularly around Johannesburg. And those high rates of circular migration have continued and are high for both men and women. And from the outset, migration and HIV have been closely intertwined. And the way the epidemic was initially spread, or one of the many mechanisms, was men going to the mines to work, living in sort of terrible conditions, thousands of people, having interactions with sex workers, and then coming back and kind of infecting their rural partners. And that was believed to be one of the reasons that it took off so rapidly. Another sort of key population I've alluded to were young females. So these graphs here, females on the left, males on the right, show HIV incidence. So that is the rate of new HIV infections, and prevalence, or the proportion infected, kind of show you where you've come from, where the epidemic has been before. Incidence or new infections show where we're going. And what these graphs showed was that in young females aged about 24 years old, HIV incidence was 8 new infections per 100 person years. So that means if you take 100 HIV negative females, follow them up for 1 year, about 8 will become infected at the end of the year. And you think of that year on year on year. So quickly those add up to very high numbers. And males much lower, and generally sort of much later as well. So peak age of infection substantially later. But what that meant is that a young girl entering adolescence would have an 80% lifetime chance of acquiring HIV in the absence of competing risk of death. So we're really talking about an epidemic of staggering proportions. So those are two of the particularly vulnerable groups. Now with the what. So I want to speak about two things with the what. What is driving, what are the main drivers, and then what are the interventions. So in terms of the drivers, there's obviously this kind of big gap between knowledge of AIDS, which was thought to be generally quite good, and behavior change. And prior to HIV, to antiretrovirals being sort of widely available, a lot of money was being poured into these sort of behavioral campaigns. And one of the biggest campaigns was around multiple concurrent sexual partnerships. And so if you look at this document from one of the institutes, Seoul City, the last couple of lines there, the program is embarking on a 3-year HIV prevention campaign, which aims to reduce new infections in the region by focusing on multiple concurrent partnerships. And multiple concurrent partnerships basically stated that the reason HIV had taken off so much in Africa was that people didn't have more partners over time, but they had more sort of partners at the same time. They had more longer-term relationships with multiple partners. And the kind of mathematics behind it sounded very elegant, and it was an elegant theory, but it lacked absolutely any sort of evidential base. And it had kind of become accepted wisdom that what one had to do was just focus these campaigns on sort of concurrent sexual partnerships. And the problem was that it was a very difficult message to get across, because the messaging was very confused. It was like, you can have lots of partners, but just don't have them at the same time. It's very difficult for people to know what was right, what was wrong. And there were these sort of papers that were published saying they do not explain HIV in epidemics. In Africa, where is the evidence? And also sort of querying some of the assumptions in the mathematics. And these models, in order to fit correctly, had to have sort of really high rates of concurrency to be able to fit the epidemics to the trends that were being seen. So this review from Sawyers and Stillwagon said a recent systematic review of the empirical evidence for concurrency theory concludes promoters of the concurrency hypothesis have failed to establish that concurrency is unusually prevalent in Africa, or that the kinds of concurrent partnerships found in Africa produce more rapid spread of HIV than other forms of sexual behavior. So this kind of took the HIV world slightly by storm, because these questions have never really been asked before, and people had just kind of assumed that this was correct. And so we were able to use the sort of outstanding geographical and epidemiological data to test this hypothesis. And for reasons that I won't go to in depth, the hypothesis is around connecting sexual networks. So having concurrent sexual partners does not affect one's individual risk over having multiple partners over a long time, but it's the connection of the networks that is supposed to enhance the spread. And so we were able to test this using data from the Africa Center. And what we did was to sort of map the number of lifetime partners across the surveillance area that people were reporting, and the number of concurrent sexual partners, or the percentage of people reporting concurrent sexual partners. And what we found was that lifetime partners, as you would completely expect, show a really strong relationship to HIV incidence, but we found no evidence that communities characterized by high levels of concurrent sexual partnerships had any, there was no variation in HIV incidence. And one of the hardest things to do in science is to publish a null finding. So we had to fight hard to get this published in the Lancet. And I think it went through about 5 revisions. But what it showed is that concurrency is a little bit of a sideshow in the epidemic context. And the recommendation was around straightforward, unambiguous messages aimed at reducing multiple partnerships, without fixating about whether they overlapped in time. And this is one of the areas that I was privileged to have quite a large impact on policy. So things changed quite rapidly as a result of this work and others that were starting to kind of question whether this was actually the cause. So this was our conclusion. We find no evidence to suggest that concurrent partnerships are an important driver of HIV incidence in this typical high prevalence settings. Our findings suggest that there's need for straightforward, unambiguous messages aimed at reduction of multiple partnerships. So able to have quite a substantial impact. In terms, just getting back to the what. So I mentioned there was this fantastic global scale up in ART, and I think previous to COVID vaccination, this was the largest public health endeavor ever undertaken, and I think COVID may well eclipse that. But South Africa has the largest epidemic in the world, with about 7.7 million people infected, and the largest now antiretroviral program in the world, so 5 million people impacted. So amazing to see where the countries come from after those dark days of Thabo and Mbeki with refusing to roll out antiretroviral therapies. And what UNAIDS and others were striving for is that they set some programmatic targets, and the aim was to get 90% of all HIV positive diagnosed. Of those diagnosed, 90% should be on treatment. Of those on treatment, 90% virally suppressed. So the 90-90-90 target. And what we wanted to do in this setting was to measure the impact of moving towards those targets on mortality, but also new HIV infections. So in terms of adult life expectancy, in 2004, at the start of the rollout, it was under 50 years of age, so about 49 years of age for adult life expectancy, which is just staggering in the 21st century. But what you can see is for every year post-rollout, there was more than one life gained across the entire population. So this incredible increase in life expectancy, increasing to about 61 years of life in 2012, and then going beyond that. But the key, and at this stage in the epidemic, before the rollout had really increased, sort of in the early days when ARVs were first being rolled out, there were essentially 2 camps. So there was the camp that believed you put all the money into treatment, and those that are infected, you try and keep them alive and give them a good standard of life. There was another group that said you just let the existing cohort die, and you basically focus all the money on prevention. And I sat in many meetings where people were seriously arguing for just letting the existing cohort die and then focus prevention on the remaining people. So it was really staggering, and it was driven by the high costs of ARVs. Then came along an incredible trial that showed that if you gave someone in a serodiscordant couple where one person is infected, the other is not, if you gave the infected person ART, there was a 96%, sorry, I took a drink. There was a 96% reduction in risk of onward transmission to the partner. So essentially, 0 chance of transmitting it on ART. And then this modeling study then people quickly modeled, well, what if we could give the entire populations ARVs and show that we could potentially eliminate the epidemic. So there were no longer two camps. There wasn't treatment and prevention, it was treatment as prevention. And so immediately, all of these trials were launched throughout Africa to kind of test if this could work in real life, because it's one thing to demonstrate it in a clinical trial where everything's perfectly monitored, to kind of being rolled out in an impoverished rural community with issues of drug supply, issues of adherence, all of these kind of things. And so these trials were all started, but then, and the one trial was actually started at our site, the Africa Health Research Institute site. But we thought there's potentially an opportunity here. What if we could use kind of geography and leverage the space-time differences in ART exposure for trying to estimate the impact? So this series of maps here shows ART coverage between 2004 and 2011. So the greens represent less than 10% of the population on ARVs, and the oranges represent greater than 40%. And so we thought, what if we can estimate what the difference in risk is for someone living in a low coverage versus a high coverage community? So living in a community where lots of people on ARVs versus where sort of very few are, on the assumption that people generally choose sexual partners from the surrounding local community. And we're able to publish this in Science, and basically what we're able to show very convincingly is that living in a community with high levels of ART coverage significantly reduced risk of acquisition of infection by about 38%. So living in a community where 40 to 50% of those are people in the community who are taking ARVs, the chance of someone acquiring HIV, HIV negative individual, was 38% less. So it's a bit like the argument we've had, or not the argument, but what's been shown with COVID, that vaccination not only prevents hospitalization and death, but also reduces the risk of sort of onward transmission. So this was very much the same argument, but this is the first time that it could be shown in a rural setting. So that completely changed the ball game, and we got these write-ups in Science, Nature, and UNAIDS welcome further evidence of the positive impact of antiretroviral therapy on preventing new HIV infections. This is just one example of kind of using spatial epidemiology to test the hypothesis. I mentioned that one of the greatest challenges in HIV has remained the sort of high levels of new infection in young females. And one of the reasons for that is it's the young males who are infected and aren't accessing care who are kind of transmitting. So the graph on the right showing viral loads in men, so showing that young men generally have much higher viral loads on average because they're not accessing treatment. So if we could get more men onto therapy, that we could reduce transmission to these young females, potentially not only increase life expectancy in the men, but also reduce transmission. So I'm PI of a cluster randomized trial that seeks to give 2 interventions to men in order to get them tested and onto treatment. One of them is a small financial incentive of $5, what's that, about £3, to get tested for HIV and linked to care. And essentially what we showed in this trial that came out a few months ago is that it increased a small financial incentive of about £3, increases uptake of testing and linkage to care by about 50%, uptake of testing by more than 50%. So these are the kind of things that have had to be thought about, thinking out the box in order to just get people onto treatment. I've spoken about the who and the what. I want to speak a little bit about the where. So one of the things that I want to get across is that the epidemic is extraordinarily heterogeneous. It's heterogeneous, as I showed, by age, by sex, a number of other dimensions, but also space. And it's something that I alluded to in the beginning of the talk. the thinking was very much that it would just explode and go everywhere. But what we've showed is that this heterogeneity has really lived on, and that presents an opportunity for targeted interventions. So this map on the left shows HIV incidence. Those ellipses demonstrate sort of formal clusters of new HIV infections that are unlikely to have arisen by chance. And those communities within the ellipses are the peri-urban communities. And the peri-urban communities with high numbers of lifetime partners, a low coverage of ARVs. So just showing that there's an incredibly high, or much higher risk of HIV acquisition in those communities. But the next question then becomes, to what extent might those individuals in those communities be playing a disproportionate role in maintaining the whole epidemic? So if populations are if they're interacting and sexual contacts with other people in other areas, is it possible that they are sort of playing a disproportionate role in epidemic spread? And if that's the case, then is that an opportunity to kind of aggressively target those communities? And we can test this with phylogenetics. And so these lines here, each line represents a linked infection. And what you can see is that, so that's two individuals who are linked by the genetics of the virus. And this is not the exact location. There's a random error in these locations for confidentiality. But these are two individuals linked by the genetics of the virus. And what you can see is that a substantial proportion of those seem to hark back to these so-called hotspot communities, giving some sort of impact, some sort of impetus to our earlier hypothesis that could be playing a disproportionate role. So in essence, we need to find a way of turning off the Broad Street pump. And this is something that's under review at the moment, hope to be published quite soon. This is a map showing the number of seroconversions, so taking the study area and looking at just total numbers, and really showing that in those hotspot communities, high numbers of individuals at specific locations. So you could spend a great deal of time and resources trying to eliminate 2 new infections in those surrounding areas, or you could focus a lot of resources on trying to get to the sort of heart of the epidemic in these communities. And colleagues and I conducted this work demonstrating that these kind of communities exist throughout Africa, and it's not just a localized phenomenon. And this was one of the areas of work that we're privileged to have quite an impact on policy. So since then, a number of organizations insisted on sort of geographic prioritization, Global Fund and others. This was some work also just taking it forward, just suggesting that by taking a geographical approach for no additional extra investment, one could have a 33% reduction in the red line there by taking a focused geographical approach. So I've looked at my background, the early years, I've touched on who, what, where, and I just want to give some kind of concluding thoughts. And to borrow a line from The Economist, is this the end of AIDS? And I'll just share a couple of recent examples. So this one published a couple of years ago, showing substantial reductions in HIV incidence, which is really good news as a result of the scale-up of antiretroviral therapy and other interventions like circumcision. We've also showed not only a substantial reduction, but a shift to the older age groups. And this is coming out actually hopefully tomorrow in PNAS, but overall reduction, but a shift towards older age groups. The older age groups kind of accounting for a greater proportion of the new HIV infections, which could mean quite a substantial change in where one targets, the age groups that one targets for these interventions. So the red in this graph represents the shape in 2004. The green represents what the epidemic curve looked like in 2019. And you can see, particularly for men, a 7-year shift in the peak age of new HIV infection, and for females, about a 3-year shift. So it's substantial changes, but a long way to go. So in conclusion, so in my view, the talk of the end of AIDS is premature. The rate of new HIV infections in the setting is still 20 to 30 times greater than the target set for elimination. And there's been massive disruption to medical supplies and ARVs during COVID, so it remains to be seen what impact that's going to have. But driving the epidemic towards elimination will require the sustained deployment of all prevention modalities tailored to suit and reach the most vulnerable groups. So I think there's a real danger, I believe, of taking our foot off the throat of the epidemic at this stage. I think this is the time to really press home the advantage that we have and drive it towards elimination. In terms of my acknowledgements, there's so many people that I could acknowledge. I'm acknowledging these people as well, but many more that have contributed over my career. Also really want to thank my family, particularly my wife, who's stood by me throughout this career. And I want to dedicate this presentation to my family, but also this incredible bunch of field workers, and I think one or two of them might be on the call as well. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Frank, for what was a fascinating and particularly personal and it's sometimes heartbreaking talk. Thank you so much. We have a few minutes for questions, so if anyone does have a question they'd like to put to Frank, if you could type it into the chat bar, then I will pass it on and we'll let Frank face the music, so to speak. So Derek is straight up with a question. What can we learn and implement from your research with HIV in tackling COVID?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks, Derek. And it has been really interesting and also obviously terrifying and heartbreaking at times. But watching sort of COVID play out and the intervention strategies that have been put in place, and things happen so quickly in comparison to HIV, which is obviously much more drawn out. Well, I think what we can learn from HIV is you can't do everything to everyone everywhere. There needs to be sort of different strategies for different populations. Certain strategies work in some contexts, some of them won't. But I think one of the sort of big issues around HIV has been stigma. And so it's very much an underground type disease, something that no one wants to talk about. And that's something that's been very different with COVID. At least it's out in the open. There might be some stigma if you have to self-isolate and your colleagues have to, or you get infected and your colleagues have to self-isolate. But in general, it's much more out in the open. So I think keeping it out in the open, thinking about different strategies for different contexts. But I think that also the big difference with COVID has been the vaccine. For 20 years, people have been searching for an HIV vaccine, and that has never been found. So I think that immediately just, once you've got the vaccine, an effective vaccine, you're immediately in a different ballgame. But I think there's always going to be a sort of case for mopping up certain populations in different ways. And so I think that's, probably the greatest lesson.
Great. So, they're all, the questions are floating around in front of me. Neil asks, we know other STIs can enhance the transmission of HIV. Has the pattern of other STI transmission followed that of HIV with peaks of infection in older age groups? So is HIV behaving differently from other STIs?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. That's a really good question. And to be honest, I don't know. So we haven't done any recent STI surveys in that setting. So what's been quite interesting, I think in the paper that's coming out tomorrow, hopefully, is we kind of unpick what some of the reasons might be for that age shift. And partly, I think it's due to kind of decreasing force of infection. so that people need more cumulative exposures until they kind of get infected, so that pushes it older. Also because people are surviving into their older ages with HIV, there's a greater conglomeration of infected individuals in the older age groups. There's several other sort of dynamics at play, but it would be very interesting to see what the STIs are doing, because that would give a sort of clear insight into what behaviors are changing. So yeah, I don't know, but I'd love to find out.
Great. So I think probably our last question, Georgiana asks, there's recent news of a trial in the UK and Uganda of HIV vaccination following the same principle as a COVID scheme. How do you think this is different compared to previous methods? And if it's successful, how fast might it be rolled out in less developed countries?
Yeah, it's a great question, and to be honest, I don't know how different it is to what's been done before. I know there've been sort of tens or hundreds of different strategies tried as far as vaccination with HIV is concerned, and COVID has sort of the clear spike protein which can be targeted by the vaccines, and with HIV there's all these different areas. So to be honest, I don't know, but I think if it was found to be successful, that was something that could be rolled out quite quickly and could be an absolute game changer. But I think a lot of people have grown quite skeptical over the years, with sort of one disappointment after the other. So it remains to be seen, but we'll watch it with great interest.
Brilliant. So I think that's a lovely place to stop it, kind of watch this space moment. There are already a lot of thanks coming in the chat. So I hope you can now join me in the chat in thanking Frank for what was an absolutely fantastic lecture. And we hope to hear more from him at some other point. Thank you, Frank.
Great. Thanks, Jess. A great pleasure.